I never thought it would happen to me. Not after 20 years of doing everything right. Not after building a life on trust and responsibility. And yet, there I was, staring at an email on my work laptop, the words burning on the screen. This is your fault. My name is Michael Reynolds. I was 46, living in a quiet suburb outside Indianapolis. I worked in operations management at a regional logistics company. Long hours, spreadsheets, conference calls, the kind of job that leaves you tired but satisfied at the end of the week. I like stability. I liked predictability. My weakness, if I had one, was trust. I gave it too freely, assuming loyalty was reciprocal. I had been married to Laura for nearly 2 decades. She handled the finances, claiming she had it all under control. I trusted her. I rarely questioned her decisions, only glanced at statements now and then. Our mornings were simple. Coffee at the kitchen counter, brief chatter about schedules, the kids off to school. Evenings were quiet. A few dishes, catching up on emails, sometimes a half-watched sitcom. Nothing glamorous, but dependable. The kind of life most people would kill for. It all started with a small, almost imperceptible shift. Laura became tense when money was mentioned. Questions I'd asked 1,000 times before suddenly seemed to irritate her. Conversations ended abruptly, and whenever I tried to clarify anything, I got vague responses, excuses, and sometimes subtle blame. I chalked it up to stress. Work was heavier, bills higher. Everyone has phases, right? But the first real shock came on an ordinary Thursday. I had gone to the local Fifth Third Bank branch to update a beneficiary form for our joint savings account. The teller typed for a few moments, then looked up at me with a polite, puzzled expression. That account was closed, she said. I laughed nervously. Surely it was a mistake, a clerical error, maybe an outdated system. But when I checked online later that night, the balance read 0. Closed months ago. I drove home in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. When I asked Laura casually at dinner, "Did we move the savings somewhere else?" she froze for just a moment. That moment told me everything. Her answer didn't explain anything. She deflected, sighed, and then said, "Well, I thought you'd be okay with how I handled it. Markets were unpredictable, and maybe if you were paying more attention." Her words trailed off, leaving the blame squarely on my shoulders. Somehow, I was irresponsible. Somehow, I was the one at fault. I couldn't sleep that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every financial discussion we'd ever had. A chilling thought settled in. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And if I rushed, if I confronted her too quickly, I might push the truth further underground. So I chose silence. Not weakness, not fear, but patience, observation, strategy. The next days blurred together in a strange mixture of routine and hyper-awareness. I paid attention to everything. Laura's phone habits, the way browser tabs disappeared when I entered the room. Mail stopped arriving physically, replaced by paperless statements and online alerts I didn't recognize. Every small detail became a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but had no choice but to. Work became harder. Numbers that once felt predictable now carried weight. Every decision reminded me that the one place I thought stable, my marriage, had become a minefield. Then came the first red flag. Laura mentioned an advisor she'd been consulting. Casually, rehearsed almost like she had been saying the same lines for months. "He's helping me navigate opportunities, minimize losses." The language felt off. Professional sounding, but hollow. When I asked for a name, she shrugged. "It's not important. You wouldn't understand anyway." That sentence stayed with me long after the conversation ended. The next day, I requested access to our shared accounts under the excuse of updating insurance documents. Laura hesitated, then insisted on sitting beside me while I logged in. Balances were fragmented. Accounts I didn't recognize. Transfers labeled vaguely. Withdrawal spaced just far enough apart to avoid notice. Still, no smoking gun, so I slowed down even more. I pulled old statements from archived emails. I created a spreadsheet at work, stayed late to cross-reference dates. Patterns emerged. The savings hadn't disappeared overnight. They had bled out slowly. Small, consistent amounts that added up to everything we'd built. Then came the second red flag. Laura started mentioning future plans requiring money we clearly no longer had. Renovations, trips, even talks of retirement. It wasn't denial. It was performance. She needed me to believe the illusion, so I wouldn't look behind it. The turning point came through an unexpected source. An old colleague from my logistics days reached out after noticing my name on a professional forum. We met for coffee. Casual conversation turned serious when he mentioned uncovering fraud at his previous firm. Most people don't lose money in one bad decision, he said. They lose it by trusting the wrong person too long. That line felt like a warning meant just for me. I asked him, hypothetically, what'd he do if he suspected financial deception within a marriage? He didn't hesitate. Document everything, quietly, and don't tip your hand. That night, I began building a record. Screenshots, downloaded statements, time-stamped notes. I backed everything up to a cloud account Laura didn't know existed. I stopped using our home computer and worked from my phone or office laptop instead. And that's when the unease became undeniable. The savings were gone. The trust one had given freely was compromised. And I realized I was in danger. But I still had one thing they didn't. Proof. The days that followed were a strange mix of routine and vigilance. At work, I carried spreadsheets, statements, and notes in my briefcase like a secret arsenal. At home, I acted normal. I laughed at Laura's jokes, helped with the kids' homework, nodded along as she spoke about future plans, all while quietly building a mental map of what was real and what wasn't. I noticed small but consistent inconsistencies. Expenses that didn't match our accounts, charges for vendors I'd never heard of, and transfers to a certain Evan Marshall that appeared more than once. Every time I asked casually about a charge, Laura brushed it off with vague answers. It's part of the new investment strategy. Don't worry. But worry was exactly what I couldn't afford to ignore. I started my own investigation. Every evening, after the kids were in bed, I cross-referenced bank statements, downloaded old emails, and documented transactions. Each transfer, each fee, each withdrawal was logged in a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and notes. I didn't want assumptions. I wanted evidence. Then came the clever twist. I discovered that some of the consulting fees she claimed were legitimate had actually been sent to untraceable accounts under the guise of corporate names. And every time she thought I was busy with work, she repeated the same mistake, using the same channels, assuming I was oblivious. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't just hiding money. She was hiding herself. I began small tests, tracking receipts, noticing patterns in her schedule, seeing who called and when. I noticed Laura suddenly taking her phone into the bathroom and staying longer than necessary. Browser tabs disappeared as soon as I walked in. Mail stopped arriving physically, replaced by statements I didn't recognize. The details painted a picture I couldn't ignore. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. One evening, Laura mentioned Evan Marshall again. This time, she said he had offered advice for a personal project. The casual tone didn't match the frequency of the transfers I had documented. Something about the phrasing, the rehearsed casualness, set off alarms. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I went back to the basics. I pulled up old tax returns, statements, archived emails, anything I could use to map the flow of money. The data revealed something startling. The losses hadn't occurred in a single transaction or a single bad investment. They were incremental, methodical, calculated. Every time I had trusted Laura blindly, she had gained a little more control and a little more freedom to misdirect funds. I also started looking into Evan Marshall. Public records showed he wasn't licensed, wasn't affiliated with a registered firm, and had a history of failed businesses and legal disputes. That meant he had no authority to manage anyone's money professionally. And yet, large sums of our savings had gone to him. I felt anger, yes, but mostly clarity. I knew what I needed to do next. First, I secured my position. I created separate accounts, updated passwords, froze any shared accounts that could be manipulated without my consent, and moved personal funds to places she didn't have access. Every action was legal, meticulous, and invisible. I couldn't afford drama. Not yet. Then I built my case. I documented transfers, noted discrepancies, and downloaded every piece of evidence. I even took photos of mailed statements that arrived without my knowledge. I wasn't reacting, I was preparing. The real turning point came one Friday evening. Laura invited me to a dinner she said was a celebration of a breakthrough with Evan. Normally, I might have gone along, nodded politely, and pretended enthusiasm. This time, I had a plan. I didn't confront her publicly. I didn't argue. I listened. I asked subtle questions that prompted her to give details she didn't realize she was confirming. Every word, every casual comment was recorded in my mind and later cross-referenced with my documentation. I learned the truth gradually but definitively. Evan had been siphoning funds under the guise of projects that didn't exist. Some were personal, some were investments that never materialized. The transfers matched dates of her vacation trips, shopping sprees, and even her discretionary spending. She had blamed external circumstances, me, and the market, but the truth was closer to home. Then came the small victories. I approached a financial counselor with the evidence, presented it calmly, and got confirmation that what I suspected was real. The funds had been misused under false pretenses. The counselor even advised that legal consultation would be prudent, but only after I had collected all possible evidence. That's when I realized the subtle advantage I had been building all along. Laura had grown careless. By pretending all was fine, she assumed I was oblivious. By keeping quiet, observing, and documenting, I now had leverage. She had underestimated patience. And patience, in situations like this, can be far more powerful than confrontation. The first major confrontation came in the form of a single question. One Sunday morning after breakfast, I asked casually, "Have you talked to Evan this week?" Her reaction was telling. A slight pause, a glance away, then a careful, rehearsed answer. "Of course. Just updates on projects." I didn't challenge her. I just nodded. That small nod was enough. It confirmed what I already knew, and what she hadn't realized she had revealed. Next, I escalated quietly. I scheduled an appointment with a trusted attorney, presented all the data, and outlined plan. I didn't accuse Laura. I didn't dramatize. I let the facts speak. Within a week, formal letters were sent to accounts. Transfers were investigated, and restrictions were placed on any movement of funds. Laura noticed the shift, but she didn't know the depth of my preparation. I had created a system where her usual tricks, evasions, excuses, manipulations no longer worked. And that's when the second twist hit. Laura, thinking I had accepted blame, began to slip further. Transfers became sloppy. Conversations with Evan grew careless. Emails I had once never been allowed to see now appeared on shared devices she forgot were linked to me. Her overconfidence became my advantage. One night, reviewing statements quietly, I found a series of transfers that finally revealed the full scope. Some money had been hidden in personal accounts under Evan's name, some in investments that didn't exist, and some had simply disappeared. Every transfer matched the timeline I had carefully documented over weeks. I didn't act immediately. Not yet. The story wasn't ready to unfold. I had waited this long. I could wait a little longer. By the time I finally moved to confront the situation legally, I had a complete picture. The evidence was irrefutable. Every transfer, every misdirection, every false story Laura had told was documented and backed by official records. I knew I had won, not with anger, not with yelling, but with patience, observation, and careful action. That's when I realized something else. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was emotional. And the cleverest part of revenge wasn't about money. It was about clarity, about showing that deceit cannot survive scrutiny. By the end of part 2, I had the upper hand. Laura thought she controlled the narrative, but the proof was mine. And when the full truth came out, there would be no one left to shift. Blame too. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. At home, everything looked normal. Laura moved around with her usual composure, checking her phone, managing tasks, and pretending the tension wasn't there. But I knew better. I had the proof I needed, and patience had become my ally. Every document, screenshot, and note I had carefully collected was now a shield, a tool, and a lever all at once. I didn't confront her immediately. I didn't need to yell or accuse. Doing so would have given her time to cover her tracks or manipulate the story further. Instead, I let the quiet control the house. I stayed calm, continued my daily routine, and acted as if nothing had changed. I was aware of every small detail, the way she answered her phone, the quick mouse clicks on her laptop, the slight hesitation in her voice when I asked about mundane things. Every small slip told me that my patience was working. The first breakthrough came when Laura requested a withdrawal from one of her joint accounts. Normally, I would have approved it immediately, trusting her judgment as I always had. This time, I calmly reviewed the balance, checked the history, and quietly denied the request, not as punishment, but as necessary protection. She hesitated, her confident facade faltering just enough for me to see it. The first cracks were appearing. Over the next week, I moved carefully, methodically. I changed passwords, set alerts on every account, and separated some of my personal income to ensure full control over my own finances. I also quietly scheduled a consultation with a forensic accountant under a discreet name to verify every transaction. Each step was calculated, deliberate, and legal. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming control. Then came the subtle, psychological twist. I started interacting with her differently. I listened more than I spoke. I nodded, agreed, even apologized once for not being more involved. An apology I didn't mean emotionally, but one that made her careless. She relaxed, thinking the blame game still worked. She stopped hiding certain details as carefully, made transfers more openly, and spoke freely about her plans and investments. Every word, every action was now documented, a perfect record of her manipulation. The moment of truth arrived quietly. Laura mentioned Evan casually, calling him an advisor, helping her manage some side investments. That was my cue. I had already traced his background. He wasn't licensed, had a checkered record, and had been involved in questionable financial dealings. Using the evidence I'd gathered, I approached the forensic accountant again, and together we compiled a full report showing the misappropriation, the false accounts, and the unauthorized transfers. With everything documented, I consulted a lawyer. We developed a plan to recover what could be recovered and to protect what remained. The legal process began quietly, through formal letters, account freezes, and official notifications. Laura couldn't manipulate the story anymore. The proof was undeniable. The slow, methodical strategy had stripped her of any power she had held for so long. When she realized what was happening, the change was immediate. The confident, controlling woman I had known became cautious, hesitant, and even fearful. She tried excuses at first, blaming circumstances, markets, or misunderstandings. But each statement was countered with proof, screenshots, bank records, emails. The narrative she had built crumbled under the weight of facts. Friends and family noticed subtle changes. I maintained discretion, sharing only what was necessary. But people could sense the shift. Laura's usual attempts to control perceptions failed. Inconsistencies in her stories became obvious to those around her. Support came quietly from old colleagues, friends who had witnessed similar situations, even my parents who offered perspective instead of judgment. Their voices reminded me that accountability doesn't mean vengeance. It means clarity and protection. The legal process moved at its own pace, slower than I wished, but thorough. Over time, a substantial portion of the misappropriated funds was recovered. The remaining losses were a painful reminder of the cost of misplaced trust. But the true victory wasn't in reclaiming money. It was in regaining control, restoring boundaries, and proving, first to myself and then to the world, that I had acted with integrity. Months passed, and life began to normalize. Laura eventually moved out, and the house felt lighter, calmer, more secure. I downsized, simplified, and took full responsibility for my personal and financial life. Every decision became deliberate, every transaction documented, every relationship evaluated with care. The betrayal had been painful, but it also forced me to grow, to become more vigilant, more analytical, and ultimately more empowered. Reflecting on it now, I realize the key lessons are simple, yet profound. Trust is not a substitute for verification. Shared responsibility matters, and no amount of love can replace accountability. Patience is power. Sometimes the smartest move is to observe quietly, document carefully, and let the truth reveal itself. Control your response, not the situation. Emotional reactions can cloud judgment, while calm, deliberate action creates leverage and clarity. I also learned that community matters. Allies, friends, family, even professional advisors can provide guidance, perspective, and support when deception threatens to overwhelm. The quiet reassurance of others helped me navigate the aftermath without losing myself. Years later, the financial loss still matters, but it no longer defines me. What defines me is how I acted, with patience, strategy, and integrity. I rebuilt my life, rebuilt my trust in myself, and learned that accountability is not just a concept. It's a tool, a shield, and a path to clarity. If you ever find yourself in a situation where trust is tested or betrayal threatens your stability, ask yourself, what would you do if you had all the proof? How would you act if patience were your strongest weapon? Sometimes, the quietest steps you take in the shadows are the ones that restore balance, dignity, and control. The story ends not with revenge, but with wisdom. Not with anger, but with reflection. And if you take one lesson from my experience, let it be this: protect yourself. Observe carefully, document meticulously, and never underestimate the quiet, deliberate power of accountability. Because sometimes proving the truth isn't about confrontation. It's about letting reality speak louder than words ever could.